Hola, buenos días. Buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por venir a este seminario. El día de hoy vamos a dar inicio al seminario del Centro de Investigación y Evaluación Encuestas en la red de seminarios institucionales sobre el tema de gestión de datos gubernamentales, confidencialidad y ética en el acceso a datos. Eh, como introducción, les queremos pues también comentar, estamos en una era en que los datos son un recurso estratégico para la toma de decisiones, la innovación tecnológica y el desarrollo de políticas públicas informadas. En este contexto, el acceso a uso de datos, particularmente aquellos de carácter personal o sensible, plantea importantes desafíos éticos, legales y técnicos que requieren atención rigurosa y reflexiva. Este seminario tiene como objetivo abrir un espacio de análisis y diálogo sobre los principales principios y prácticas que deben guiar la gobernanza de datos, entendida como el conjunto de normas, procesos y estructuras que rigen la recolección, almacenamiento, uso, intercambio y protección de la información. Abordaremos algunos lineamientos nacionales o internacionales y discutiremos los mecanismos para garantizar la confidencialidad de los datos y la protección de los derechos de las personas, especialmente en el ámbito de la investigación, la salud pública y los sistemas de información estadísticos. Asimismo, se explorarán dilemas éticos contemporáneos asociados al uso secundario de datos, mucho de lo que nosotros trabajamos aquí en el NSP. Trabajaremos la reidentificación de individuos y el equilibrio entre la apertura de datos y la privacidad de los datos confidenciales, reconociendo la creciente presión por generar evidencia a partir de grandes volúmenes de datos. Este seminario propone también reflexionar sobre la responsabilidad institucional y profesional en la gestión de estos recursos, promoviendo una cultura de uso ético, transparente y responsable de los datos. Esperamos que este espacio contribuya a fortalecer capacidades institucionales y generar recomendaciones prácticas para el diseño e implementación de políticas de datos que sean justas, seguras y alineadas con los principios de equidad, inclusión y respeto a los derechos humanos. Para este seminario tenemos como invitado el día de hoy al doctor Félix Ricci. Él es profesor de Economía Aplicada en la Universidad del Oeste de Inglaterra, en la Universidad de Bristol, donde también dirige el Centro de Economía y Finanzas de Bristol y la Red de Acceso y Gobernanza de Datos, que tiene como siglas su nombre, Dragon. Su investigación se centra en la economía laboral, así como en la gestión de datos gubernamentales, la confidencialidad y la ética en el acceso a datos, y conoce, maneja y crea todos los lineamientos de uso de datos en el Reino Unido. Bueno, colabora con esto. Es reconocido por desarrollar el marco de los 5 SAFE que hoy nos va a presentar, y este es ampliamente utilizado para evaluar y gestionar el acceso seguro a datos confidenciales en Inglaterra, y el día de hoy nos va a estar compartiendo su experiencia. Doctor Félix, le agradezco mucho y le doy la palabra.
Thank you, Lena Sphere. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Does it not? Do I need to hold it? Yeah. All right. Okay. Is that better? Ooh. All right. Okay. Got one of these. I'm ready to go. Okay. Buenos dias. That's as far as my Spanish will go, I'm afraid. So I'm going to talk to you today about confidential data management. I've been doing this for a very long time. That's part of the reason we're in Mexico City at the moment. I'm here with my colleague Pedro, who's my PhD student, looking into all these aspects of how data governance and data management works in government organizations, public sector organizations. What I'm going to cover today is a surprise. That we're at? No. Oh, the yellow one. Right, too many buttons. Okay. So this is what we're going to cover today. Is this? Ah, this might not be the last version of the slides. One moment. I took that first slide out. This is not the latest. This is not the latest version of the slides. Hang on one moment. Yeah, I'll have it. It's version. Well, I'll give you that, Pedro. It's version 2 in that folder. While we're changing the slides, I should just talk through and tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm here, which means we can skip the next 2 slides. So I joined the UK Statistics Office in 2002. I was brought in as an economist to try and understand how to make all their data available for researchers, because prior to that, some friends of theirs came in, used computers, produced stuff, and that was it. And I was asked to turn that into an industrial process. That's what I did for 10 years. Then I moved to the university and I started advising more organizations and different organizations. And that's what I do now. So I run a team called Dragon. This is a group of economists, health researchers, philosophers, lawyers, computer scientists, anyone that has an interest in good data governance and management. And we play quite a large role in the UK plans for data management. For example, can we go back one slide, please? Okay, just do back one slide. No, that's not, there should be version 2. Okay, give me 2 seconds. Apologies, you can give us 2 minutes and then we'll come back.
Hola, vamos a dar unos minutos. El presentador quiere colocar una presentación más actualizada. Una disculpa. 2 minutos, por favor.
Right. Okay, right. We'll try again. Thank you for the intermission. So what we're going to talk today is I'm going to talk about aspects of data governance and how we get access to confidential data for research purposes. Now, I know a lot of you might not be directly involved with making those decisions, but what I want to do is to see how those decisions are made first, why they're sometimes made well, why they're made badly. And then what we're going to do is we're going to end up with thinking about how does the research community contribute to this. So very briefly, as I said, I've been here a long time doing this. And the key point here is what we do in our group is we are quite key parts of the data community in the UK and abroad. We advise, we design lots of things, and we work with governments around the world, including, for example, in ECHI in Mexico. And we also do lots and lots of teaching of researchers, of people in data services, of people in health projects in developing countries. So what we're going to do first of all is think about how can we get an idea of what data governance or data management is about? And the key thing is when we think about giving access to this sort of data, there are lots and lots of different people have different views. The IT department might think about things, but that depends upon whether you've anonymized the data. The anonymization might depend upon the law. The law might depend upon what the users will get away with. I think that they can deal with de-identified data. That would depend upon the contracts, which depend upon the anonymization, and on and on and on. Every bit of this is quite complicated, and we end up with lots of conversations going on, trying to understand who is the person who can make decisions about these things. So what we developed for this was a structure called the 5 safes. This is a way of trying to sort out this mess and give us a way of thinking in a structured way about data governance. So 5 components of it. First of all, what are we trying to achieve here? What is the point of this project? Who are the users going to be? What is the public benefit of this? What happens at the end of the project? So all those big questions about why are we making access to this data available? And that's our safe projects. The second question is, who are the people involved? Okay, so we have researchers involved. What about the data managers? What about the data owners? Do they need to have some involvement on that? Do we need to train them? What about the people who are dealing with output checking? Okay, what about the technical environment? How physically are we going to store this data? Who's going to be responsible for it? Does the data need to be made secure from external hacking, or is it very low risk data? How much detail have you got in there? You're working with health data, so typically that's both very sensitive and very identifiable. In other words, we can look at the data and we're quite likely we might be able to find out who that person is. So that's quite high risk data. But the point of having this data is so that we can do research. So the aim is not to minimize data, is to make sure that we have the appropriate data to allow us to do our research. And lastly, something that we often forget about, but hopefully everyone in INSP will shortly be fantastic at, is output checking, making sure that the results you produce from this don't accidentally breach confidentiality. Okay, so put all those together and we get safe use. Now, the point is that there are not being safe on every one of these things what matters. What we can think of is that, for example, if we're going to release data files which are completely anonymous, We've put all the effort into making the data safe because we don't know who's going to use it, where they're going to use it, what they're going to use it for. So if it's a file designed to be going on the internet or a public use research file, then we put all the effort into the data. If, on the other hand, you want to work in the INECI secure lab, well, they have lots of checks on the people that come in. They make sure the projects are valid, they have a secure environment, so you can have really sensitive data in there. And somewhere in the middle, you have data which you allow people to download and take away. So you know who's getting that data. You have contracts with them. You ask them to make some commitment to their IT. But generally, you also know that people can do silly things with the data, so you don't give them as much information as you would in the secure lab. Now, the key point about this is that when you're thinking about data access design, you can think about these things separately, because each one of these, we know how to do anything that we want. For example, when I'm thinking about the projects, the big project plan, I know that once I've decided what I'm going to do, I can build an IT system that meets that need. I can train researchers appropriately. So I can think about the projects on their own without having to worry about everything else. Does that make sense to everyone? Look around for vague nods. Okay, so this is pretty much the universal framework in the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, certainly for social science, increasingly for health research as well. It's quite common in Europe, US. It's also being used in INECI and probably in other parts of Latin America shortly. So why do we use this? Because it's very simple, 5 things to think about. And it's comprehensive because we should be able to put everything into one of these boxes. It's also quite flexible. It doesn't really tell you how to do anything. It's all about how to help structuring your thinking. And it's easy to explain to the public. So, for example, the UK equivalents of the INECI Data Lab, they all have public engagement programs where they go out to the public, explain what they're doing, explain why it's a good thing. And this is really something that the public enjoys. It's very simple. They understand it, are very, very comfortable with very sensitive data being made available to researchers in this framework. It's also increasingly common. So that makes it useful because it now means we have a shared language. For example, if we want to talk about, for example, INSP and sharing data with INECI, at the moment, you're not using this framework, but imagine that you were, then you could start asking questions about, well, is the INECI IT system of an equivalent standard to the INSP one? Do the training that INECI researchers have, is that equivalent to what we do in INSP? And you can start discussing how you can share information in a structured way using the same language. Okay. So, thing about that, though, it doesn't actually tell you anything. Once you've decided what you want to do, this is really helpful for managing your solutions. So what we need to think of next is how do we get there? And one of the key issues here is we keep trying to persuade people to start with the principles. Quite often in the public sector, we think, right, I've got an issue, here's my solution, I'll start building it. I'll build what I built before, or make it slightly better, or I'll build what someone else has got. One of the things that really makes a difference to whether you have a sustainable data access solution is how much you can say, what are the principles that underlie your project? So, for example, your principles should say things like, what are you trying to achieve? What are your goals? So here are some examples. All our data should be accessible for research use. Is that a principle which INSP could sign up to? If not, what would be the principle that you would sign up to? Charges should not be a significant barrier to research use, or geography should not be a significant barrier. You have a large country. Can people always get to the places where they need to analyze the data? So maybe that could be one of your principles, thinking, okay, this is what we're going to do. Now that is a principle. What you now start using, thinking, okay, how do we turn that into practice? how do we make decisions about where we can access our data from? Do we only end up sending out data because we can't build secure labs everywhere? So as a consequence of making sure that geography shouldn't limit research more than is necessary, we might spend more time building files which can be sent out to people rather than trying to build laboratories where people have to come to them. Okay? So, key point for this is that when we start thinking about principles, is we start thinking about strategic goals. This is what we always try to get across to organizations, that if you don't have these sorts of core principles, how can you also identify your strategic goals? I mean, my organization, the university I work for, has lovely strategic goals. They're completely meaningless because they're broad, fluffy ideas, don't tell you how to do anything useful. What we're trying to say here is we need to get down and start being specific. So something like all our data should be accessible for research use is now a much more specific goal. So, okay, if it's not being available, why not? Let's challenge that. So it helps us to be better in our strategic planning. It helps transparency. We can show what we're doing. It's also easier if you may have your own data, but if you're thinking about working with other partners and sharing data with them, this really helps the conversations, because you might do things differently from other people, but what you might be able to agree on is the principle underlying it. Okay. For example, if you have any of your projects that you run here, you probably need to go through ethical approval. Let's supposing someone comes to you and says, well, I've already been through INECI's ethical approval process. So INECI's approval process is different from yours. But if you could agree that what the aims of both those processes were the same, then you can start saying, okay, well, if they've already approved it, we don't need to do that approval as well. If we talk about the details of what your processes are and how many people look at this thing and what are they checking, we don't get very far. But if we can agree that this is the purpose of our ethical approval checking, then we can start to think about, okay, we can agree to be different in detail, but we can agree to have the same principles. One thing also that's quite important in government is, quite often we've seen it so many times, is great things happen in data governance and access to data because of one inspirational individual, or one person who makes a difference, or one project that changes things. The problem is what happens when that individual leaves, or when the project is finished. And time and again, you see something. This is a great example of how to provide access to data for research, and then the person leaves, and then other people come in and take it over who haven't got the same interest or the same knowledge. One of the things reasons why we're really keen on encouraging organizations to have clear statements of their principles is because what we're trying to do is say that these can exist outside of any individual, outside of any project. So this gives us a much more sustainable way of thinking about things. I can think of good examples of organizations where, you know, we've seen exactly that. Great ideas, all goes very well. When people leave, it all goes downhill. And I can also think of good examples of organizations where they got very clear idea of what they are aiming to do. And people change, people move on, but the process still works. So all of these things make a big difference to the operation on that. It does require more effort, but this is one of the ways which we get stability. And as we're going to look at in the next section, because there are so many things to be scared about, once we have a good solution, it's really, really important that we can keep that solution going without having to go back to the start each time. So that tells us, principles tell us where we want to be, what we're trying to achieve. Our 5 safes tells us, once we know where we're going, how can we get there usefully. But the third thing we need to talk about is about attitudes. So in the public sector, these are going to be really important. You know, in the private sector, we have different motives, different incentives. In the public sector, we're not selling stuff. We are doing things for public goals. It's very hard sometimes to specify what that goals are. We're also conscious that we are working with public resources, public money. We got a responsibility to our data holders. So there are a lot of questions that are not have simple answers to them. How we're going to make our decisions is probably the most important factor in whether we get good data access or not. So plans are implemented by people. That means that people and their way that they think about things really matters. So those attitudes and the incentives set by organizations are going to make a very large difference. Because remember, it's not just the people themselves, it's what the organization tells you about how it works that can make a big difference. So if you get this wrong, you are going to end up with worse solutions. Okay, you're typically going to end up with less effective solutions, because instead of thinking where you want to be, you spend a lot of time worrying about what you're currently doing and what potentially might go wrong. It's a lot more effort, because without that clear goal and clear idea about what matters and what doesn't matter, you end up having lots of pointless arguments with people, or maybe you think they're useful arguments, but from a perspective external, I can see this is not really helping any useful questions. Most importantly, the chances are you're going to end up thinking about how do you minimize risk rather than maximize benefit. Because that's the nature of us working in the public sector, that, you know, we have a lot of incentives to avoid doing things that they might go wrong, because we don't get much benefit if they go right. We're all worried about failure. That's what drives us quite a lot. And we have lots of frameworks in place to make sure that any decision that's made is very cautious, it's very sensible. But if you're starting from the position that you need to be cautious and sensible, you're going to end up in a position that's cautious and sensible, not necessarily a good position. And that good position can be cautious and sensible, but if you started from somewhere else, you are going to end up with a different level of caution and sensibility. So let's give an example from that. So why is this quite often defensive thinking in here? Why do we tend to be quite cautious about this? First thing is that everyone tends to have an opinion. You know, if you talk about data management, you talk about privacy to your friends, to your family, to your colleagues. You know, everyone knows what privacy is. Everyone has an opinion. You might say you are using the data for something. People can think, oh, that might be my data. What do I think about this? So lots of people have an opinion about this. Many people have expertise, but many people are expert in specific areas only. For example, the legal team, very good at law. Time and again, I go into an organization and I said, the lawyers won't let us do this. The lawyers say we can't do that. And it's almost always because you've not bothered to explain to the lawyers what you're trying to do. They know their expertise in their particular area. You know all about data management. It's your job to go to them, explain why what they want is something, what you want is something that they can help you to manage. Okay, the question to a lawyer should never be, can we do this? It should always be, this is what we're going to do. How do we do it lawfully? Okay, and that's quite a different question, because that second question already gets you going, that's where we're going to be. How do we get there? Okay. And I'll give you an example. When I first started doing this 20 years ago, I was told to go and talk to the government lawyers about giving access. And the lawyer said, yeah, you can't give access to the academics. Here is the law. It's black and white. This data is only available to government personnel. So I thought, yeah, that's true. And I went away and I thought about it for a couple of days later. And then I went back to the lawyer and I said, how do we make academics government personnel for the purposes of getting access to this data? And he said, oh, well, these are the different ways that you can do that. So reframing the question, saying, I don't want your opinion on the law, because I can repeat that myself, what that says. What I want you to do is your opinion to take what I'm going to do and tell me how I can make that work. And again, different examples in our tax department. then they ask the legal team to review all of the applications for data access. All of the data applications for data access were rejected initially because the lawyers looked at them and said, well, this is the function of a tax department. What is this research about? It doesn't serve any of our functions. I'm going to reject it. Because no one had bothered to take the time to explain to them what the purpose was and how these research projects could meet the needs of the tax department. Once they'd had that discussion, then they went back, fine. All the projects get full, lawyers say, yes, these are all fine. These are all fine. So again, thinking about how people might have expertise, but not necessarily all the expertise that you use, can be really important. And it's also clear to ask people the right questions. If I go and ask a lawyer, can I do this? Then I'm giving them the responsibility for making sure that I can do this. If I go and say, I'm going to do this, can you help me to do it legally? Then it's my responsibility to say, we're doing that. So now the lawyer can feel much more free in supporting me in my decision. Yeah. Okay. Next thing, evidence is not widely available. We've worked in this area for a long time. We have a lot of information, anecdotal. We have lots of stories like the two I just given you. That's all stories, it's all talk. There's very little information because there isn't a degree anywhere in data governance or data management. So there's quite a lot of talking amongst individuals to find out what works and what doesn't work. That means it can be really difficult to understand where the evidence is that you should be using. Lastly, most important this, some of you may know the old quote, no one gets fired for buying IBM. You know, you always take the safest option because then you can't be in trouble. Similarly here, no one gets fired for saying, I'm not sure you've proved that there's no risk here. Yeah. And you can always say that. And how could someone criticize you for that, for saying, well, I want to be more confident about the risk? Well, if I'm in the room, I will be criticizing you for that because I'll be saying, tell me exactly what your problem is. And if you can't tell me what your problem is, I'm going to ignore you. But generally, this is something which I come across a lot in discussions, or I see other people reporting this, that we have to go through, we have to consider all of the options because possibly anything might happen. The difficulty with that approach is there is no end result. So for example, Pedro here, quantum mechanics, he could suddenly transform into a penguin. So should I keep a bucket of fish ready just in case? A theoretical possibility, not really a helpful decision to be made. So this is why we need to focus on evidence and understand this and try and change attitudes. Lastly, from this, I've mentioned this already, in the public sector, we are not really very strongly incentivized for doing things right. You know, if things go wrong, we're very easily to be criticized. If you do something there, you lose data. Newspaper will be about how terrible INSP is. If you do lots of really good, interesting research, well, who cares? You know, you might find it great, but no one is going to tell anyone about this. You know, we work with the tax department. They're very careful because no one ever has a nice thing. I think the tax department has a very nice tax system for self-assessment, but generally people don't say, I'm glad we have a nice, good tax department. They're really positive. What they're more likely to say is, I hate the tax office. They're so stupid and slow and difficult. And so we only tend to get negative or more likely to get negative comments within the public sector. And that's difficult because that means that then we are strongly incentivized to avoid taking decisions, particularly to avoid taking hard decisions. This is why you might often see in government quite a lot what we might call crisis-driven decisions. You put off a decision until a decision has to be made, because at that point, it's not your fault for taking a decision. I don't know if any of you recognize this in your thing, but certainly this is something we see a lot, and this will be part of Pedro's discussions, looking at how government makes these decisions. So that's quite problematic. How do we change these? One of the things to do is we frame decisions usefully. Remember I said about going to the lawyer and I said, can we allow this? And the lawyer said no. And then I went back to the lawyer and said, this is what I plan to do. Can we use any of these things to make it work? And he said, well, these are the things you can use. That framing makes a huge difference. Similarly, we could think, should we make this data available for research? If we start from there, then we start thinking about all the reasons why not. If we say, we are going to make this data available for research, are there any problems we should be concerned about? That will give us a quite different solution. Okay, it is basic human psychology, is that if I start from complete security, but no use of the data, if I think about increasing the use of the data, I'm giving up some of the security. If I think about giving everyone the data with no checks, fine, I've got perfect use of the data, I've got no security. So I might decide to add some checks. That means I'm improving my security, but I'm losing some of the usefulness of the data because I'm not giving it to anyone. But as humans, we value losses much more than gains. So if you start from not doing anything, the thing that's always in your mind is how much control am I losing? How much security am I losing? If you start from, let's give everyone all the data they want, and then realize you don't, you're always now thinking in the first case about, yeah, but we're stopping people doing this kind of research. We're stopping people doing that. And that's what's foremost in your mind. So this framing makes a difference. When I'm working with organizations, quite often having a discussion, I want to go into that room, and the first thing I want to do is make sure that we've got a useful outcome or objective on the table. If I go into the room and someone starts by saying, well, okay, we'd ask the lawyers for a report, that is going to be a really difficult conversation. But if I go into that same room and say, great, so let's agree that the main aim of this is to make sure we have as much data available as possible. Is everyone happy with that? Then we can start doing that. Now, even if they start saying, yeah, but we're not sure about lawyers, say, no, we'll come back to the lawyers later, because clearly we have to follow the law. But what we want to do is be clear about where we're going to be. And once we've won that argument, a lot of it changes. Okay. Second thing is we can provide support for decision makers from here. Quite often people are making decisions in isolation, or they're being asked for ideas about which they might not have expertise. So it's really important we provide the support for people to make those decisions. I went to a tax department many years ago because we were using some of their data, and I thought we should probably check with them that it's okay for us to use the data before they find out and get upset. So I went and talked to some people, and they said, yes, that all seems fine. That seems great. We don't see any problem with that. I'll just check with my boss. And then they both came back to me and said, talk to my boss, and we're not very sure about this, so probably better say you'd stop doing that. So I said, okay, can I talk to your boss? Talk to their bosses. Exactly the same conversation. Yep, that seems fine, seems okay. Let me just go and talk to my boss just to make sure. I've talked to my boss. We're not very sure, we better say no. And I worked my way all the way up through the tree of the tax department until I got to the directors. And they didn't have to ask anyone else. So that was it. That was the end of the chain. But the point was, every time round, someone was being asked to make a decision which they didn't quite have the information on, which they felt uncomfortable about, and weren't happy with making that decision. So giving that support to decision makers is really, really important. Okay. And part of that is making sure the evidence is available. Okay. Challenging use of hypotheticals. I've already given you the examples, people saying, well, we could think of something. That is quite important when we're looking here, because it's an easy way to stop any project, to say, well, what if something, what if the roof collapses? What if an earthquake hits Mexico City? We can't access a physical place for a while. What if? Some of those are good what ifs. What if an earthquake hits Mexico City? That we know has credibility because it's happened. What if a meteorite lands on Mexico City? Well, then access to data is probably the least of our problems. So we're not going to consider that one. Okay, so what we get from that is we've now got an idea of how data governance is managed. This is how we would like it to be managed, okay? And what we do is when we go out to organizations, this is what we're doing. And I say go out to organizations because this takes a lot of individual discussion, talking to people, persuading them, finding people who can persuade other people on here. But this does work, and we got some really good examples of how organizations can address and solve these problems. But what we're going to finish off on that is why do researchers? So you've got a large research community in INSP. What I want to think about now is why do the researcher attitudes matter in here? Okay, so here's the first point. As I just said, decision makers are scared of everything. Okay, they're worried about a lot of stuff. They're worried about making the wrong decisions. They don't have uncertainty. Other people have particular expertise which they don't know how to counter. It's quite a worry. They also might not know any researchers or have any idea what researchers do. Okay, I mean, my sister is 5 years older than me. She still has no idea what research actually means in any meaningful context. She just knows I work at a university and I do research. And so if you don't know anyone, what they do, how they think about these things, how can you make judgments about them? Well, if you're a human and you've got to make difficult decisions, and that decision involves someone you know nothing about, you might be willing to take a very cautious line that I don't know researchers, but they're probably awful. So the third thing is they might believe that researchers don't share their values. So people making access to data will be very careful to make sure that, you know, our responsibilities and make sure that the privacy is not breached and that all this data is being used for a public benefit. We might get perceptions that, for example, researchers don't care about privacy. They don't really care about public benefit. They mostly care about getting their publications out. They don't even care about the outputs from this. There is some truth in this. You know, I'm a researcher as well, so I can talk about from the research side. And certainly researchers, unless you talk to them, probably have a very poor appreciation of the privacy issues around use of confidential data. It's not because they're malicious, and I don't know how many of you are malicious, and you all look lovely people, so I'm sure you're not malicious, but I mean, the thing is, if, you know, if we don't know anything, you've been told about what are the privacy implications and why it's important to keep data confidential, what can go wrong if you don't keep data confidential, then is it surprising that people don't share the same values as you? You haven't given them the information. So it's not about being malicious. I mean, obviously some researchers are really annoying. And they don't do what they're told, but generally researchers are very positive. When we have our training model is called the well-meaning idiot model, because basically what we're saying is researchers, they don't know a lot, but actually they are quite keen and quite positive to learn about these things if you explain to them why it's important. Typically because they're all intellectually curious, and so they want to learn new stuff from this. So it's not they don't know this because they don't want to know this, it's just because no one has possibly thought this would be useful for them to know. So there is some justification. Researchers don't share their values. Doesn't mean we can't do anything about it. So that means that the decision makers are going to see researchers as additional risk. And what our role is, whether you're a researcher, whether you are running the services, or you are data owners yourselves, we should be trying to change those attitudes. Okay. So how researchers can help. What researchers are best at is identifying the benefit of their research. If we're thinking about access, questions of data access, then sometimes it's not clear what the benefit is. You say, we're going to make some data available. It's probably got some broad idea about this will help the public in some way. But now a researcher comes up and says, okay, I've got a specific project. I'm trying to look at the impact of diabetes on cancer survival rates. Think, okay, there you go. There's our project. And what will that do? Okay, well, that will now lead to changes in prescribing, changes in treatment. This is all the stuff which researchers are really, really good at, because they're thinking all the time about what is this? Why is this an important piece of research? And they're much better at it than the data owners are, the data providers. They're also good at contributing to the principles. Things like, if I live right up in, I don't know, Baja California, I've got some great ideas, but how am I going to get access to the data? How are we going to do these things? What are your principles? Are you going to say that I'm too far away? If you have charging regimes, are you going to take account of the fact that because I'm a long way away and I have to travel, I also have to pay? I don't know the answers, but the thing is, having those conversations can help you to be much clearer about what you're trying to achieve. Okay, third point, being actively and observably compliant. What I mean by this is doing the things that you're supposed to do, and wherever it is possible, then actually also being demonstrably clearer on this. So we were at a presentation with Sophia and Lionel last week. One of the researchers, we had a couple of researchers talking about their experience of the INECI Microdata Lab, and I asked them, what do you feel your role is in terms of, do you contribute to the lab at all? And the researcher said, I think it's really important that we show that we are secure, safe people to be looking after this data, which is great. I didn't prompt her on that, but I also know that the Microdata Lab training has quite a strong element of building the community. This is also what we do in our training in the UK. So we devise a training which all social science researchers and increasingly health researchers have to go through before they get access to the secure facilities. We've had about 10,000 people go through this in the last 7 years. The most important thing, half of that course is about 4 hours long. Half of that course is about building the community. It's so that researchers understand how they fit into the whole ecosystem, how they contribute to this, how they can support each other, how the research team can support them. And it's getting the idea across is that it's not data is organized over there and I'm a researcher over here. If something goes wrong, we all lose. When something data access problem happens, no one ever turns around and says, well, that went wrong. Let's make it easier for people to get access for data. We always say that went wrong. Let's lock things down. Let's do more restrictions. Let's have more checks. It's so anything that goes wrong, it doesn't matter if Pedro does something terrible and I'm working in the lab as well. I will be tarred by association and possibly the organization. We all get hit by the outcome. So it's really important that we get everyone to understand how this whole community fits together. And that's why if we have problems, then we need to address them and make sure we separate off those problematic cases easily. Couple of obvious things, suggesting ways to improve service, and engaging with data owners, just changing people's minds to actually get to know some data owners. Okay, how are we doing for time, Pedro? Perfect. Okay, so how researchers don't help. Okay, well, these things you might, given what I've just said, you might think this is fairly obvious. The big thing that researchers don't help is by not following the rules and guidelines. That's the big thing, because that reputation that you have is really fragile. Once it's broken, it's hard to come back. If something goes on, there was a case in one country about 15 years ago now. It was a terrible case of a bunch of researchers getting together over a period of months to try and extract some data from a confidential system. Not because they wanted to steal it, just because they didn't like using the system. So they wanted to have it more conveniently on their desktops. That was a long time ago. It was an exceptional case in particular circumstances. It's still what everyone talks about. How can we trust researchers if they're willing to get together like this? So that's the sort of thing which once we break this reputation, it's gone for a very long time from here. I mean, researchers also not helpful, for example, if they don't produce nice outputs or if they get angry with support team for no reason. There are lots of reasons why they don't help, but this is the big one. Not working within the way that rules are designed is really important, because that can not just affect you and the people you're working with, but it can affect everyone, the whole system. Okay, so how we can help the researchers on here? Unsurprisingly, the answer is by explaining what we're doing. Okay, we always say to organizations, if you're training, you should be training that everything you want people to do should be explainable and explained as far as possible. Okay, so for example, when we do training for checking for outputs, so when you produce statistical research, there's a potential risk from those outputs. Lots of organizations will have a threshold. Say, for example, you must have a minimum of 10 observations before this can be published. Okay. If you just tell people that the threshold is 10 and you don't explain why, then first of all, you might get into unhelpful arguments about why is 10 better than 9? What is the difference between the two? And then why is it a rule when another organization has 5? Why can't you have 5 as a rule? There are lots of reasons why people don't think, well, it's just your organization doing something because it's INSP. They don't really care about us. They've just got a rule. So again, in a researcher training in the UK, what we do is we go through why this happens, why you have a threshold rule at all, why 3 is the smallest number, which actually makes sense, and why most organizations have a higher number because it reflects their risk preference. So at the end of half an hour of us talking to them, we got the idea that basically this is something which is not a statistical item, but it is something which reflects our organization's views. So we're not interested in you arguing whether a different number will be statistically no different. We don't care. This reflects our perspectives. Please accept this. They might not be happy with it, but at least then they understand now why you're doing what you're doing from here. No mistake, fault identification. Sorry, no fault, mistake identification. Researchers will do all sorts of weird things which you have no idea that they were going to do those things. So making sure when it's a genuine mistake that we come back and we do allow that to be identified. Our funding organization had an idea that the way to make the secure lab even more secure was to say that any breach of procedures would lead to a loss of funding, whether it's accidental or not. That was a terrible idea, because it means if you accidentally did something wrong, you would not admit to it because you would lose your funding. You would actually try to hide this thing, because what's the worst that could happen? You still lose your funding. We did persuade them to take that out and to turn it around so that, yes, I mean, there is potential for loss of funding, but generally you make a mistake. Well, actually, that's useful for us because it tells us that maybe we need to change our procedures. Leading on to that is the idea of researchers will also do deliberately stupid things. The question there is, how are we going to change that? Education, again, look at the consequences of your action. You may have got away with it this time, but you are very, very lucky. This is going to, this could have been the outcome from this. Don't do this. So going back to the education from here, and sometimes you need to punish. I would do things like throw people out of the laboratory. If people continually refuse to follow the procedures I'd set, say, fine, you're not having access. And that included internal members of ONS staff. So she went and complained to her line manager and said, tough, I run a secure lab. I'm not going to have separate rules for that person. I don't care if she works in ONS or not. You follow the rules and you use the lab. If you don't follow the rules, you're not a safe person, and I'm not letting you anywhere near confidential data. So I just love power, really. So, okay. So summary, quite a lot of stuff in there. But hopefully you see now why I went through all the why decision making first before we come to the researchers. So defining those principles, time well spent, because it helps us to be clear, and it also helps you to explain to the researchers as well what exactly you're doing on here. Thinking about how you frame this is even more important from here, getting those attitudes right, saying, okay, we know what we're doing, we know why, and how we're going to make decisions from there. And then we can have our 5 says help us get there. Right. And make researchers part of the community. I mean, if you are already, that's lovely. If you're not, then go and talk to other people here and say, we'd like to learn more about X. Right, that's it. Okay.
Thank you, Félix. Gracias. Gracias a todos los que nos están acompañando en la sala. Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta en la sala y virtual, también los virtuales pueden hacer preguntas a través de la plataforma, en el chat. Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, les pasamos el micrófono. Pueden hacerla, sí, pueden hacerla en español y Pedro, te pido el favor si no me ayudas a traducirle a Félix. Perfecto. Leo, ¿quieres preguntar? Sí.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for your presentation.
Gracias.
La voy a hacer en español. Implementar un marco de las 5 S como el que propones para dentro del instituto tiene retos, challenges para nosotros. El primero es que entendamos cómo se relaciona la gobernanza de los datos con el trabajo que hacemos día a día como investigadores o como profesores. ¿Nos puedes dar un ejemplo cómo afecta la gobernanza de datos nuestro trabajo de investigación y docencia?
He says that implementing the model, such as the 5 saves in INSP, can be a bit of a challenge because there's a need for an understanding between how following good data governance affects your research, like the research they do every day. So can you give us an example?
Yeah, I mean,
How it does?
the 5 says was originally designed for helping, well, it's originally designed to persuade the board of ONS for providing access to data, but we immediately incorporated into our training for researchers because we realized it's quite straightforward. One of the things is if you just, people come into training and they're told, okay, this is what you're doing, this is how you're working, these are what the rules you should be following, you don't get some of that context. So the reason it's there is we put it to the researchers and say, okay, this is how you fit into the helping to make all of this work well. We've got a secure facility here. We do output checking over there, and we provide you the data, and there's your project approval. You apply for a project, we looked at that. This is your part to play in making that happen. So that was how we initially started using training. It's only later on we realized it was more useful general framework. So in a way, it sort of started as a way to explain to researchers or explain to people what we were doing. Shouldn't be a problem implementing it because it is just a framework of way of discussing things. You can put anything into there. You can also use it completely badly. So it is just, it's like saying, you know, you could have a house has 4 walls, but those walls could be made of cheese. It's not really much of a house, but technically it's a house. So I think I think when you start using it, you might find it's quite straightforward because generally we find that people quite like the simplicity of it, and it helps to take a lot of different things and put them into separate boxes. And remember my first slide where I had IT and lawyers and everything else. It's allowing you to separate questions so you have different questions at different times. Okay. Again, we're on this very large project at the moment. One part of that project is output checking. So output checking is a separate bit on its own. All the other £6 million worth of work is about all the other bits. And they've said, oh, and by the way, at this point, output checking happens. Anyway, that's that project over there. We'll assume it's done well. So that's how you can use it to actually start helping you to simplify your conversations. Don't have to. I mean, we just find it's very useful in practice. That's why it's so popular.
Yeah, thank you. So we understand that we need to develop skills for all the personnel in the
Mhm.
National Institute, but where we can start with this?
So I think
Great.
that's what I can say. So I think where we'd start is actually on some of that attitudinal stuff. That is the first thing. Some of the information we've given you today to see how people fit into different parts of the organization. For example, one exercise we do in the researcher training is we get people to, we're all in the room together and we say, okay, you're going to be a data owner and you're going to be part of the secure lab management and you're going to be a researcher and you're going to be a government official who wants some research done. Tell me, what do you think of the others? And get them to come up with the most, sort of stereotypical images that they might have. And then we break that back down into trying to see, okay, so now do we understand the fits? So I would suggest that that is possibly some of the more easier starting points to understand that being part of that community, and particularly community responsibility, if we're not all working together, we are running a big, big risk. I've seen examples where someone was using a not very secure lab, but it's supposed to be secure lab, and they extracted some data because they couldn't wait for the organization to release it, so they just got it out themselves and working on it. Their colleague at the university noticed this and said, go back, tell them what you've done, delete that data off your machine, because if you don't do that, I'm going to tell them that, and you will be banned for life. So that researcher understood that the other researcher was putting his own activities at risk. And despite maybe his friend, but he said, no, you're not my friend if you're going to do this. So we have lots of evidence that this really works, that researchers will tell on each other, they will report each other, not really maliciously, but in a sense of they're aware that things are going wrong, they need to be picked up. So building this community is really quite important. And I think we've got good evidence that works. So that's where I would start. There are other things which you could think about, and you might want to review some of your training. So we spent all day yesterday at INECI, and as a result of that, we've come up with some new training, some retraining that they will be doing for their researchers and other groups. So, but I would suggest that is the first thing, get the attitudinal stuff right. Then you can start thinking about some of the other aspects, because when you have that context, as you see yourself as part of the community, then everything else is about helping you to become a better part of the community, as opposed to if you start from something like output checking straight away, then it's just another thing you're being told to do.
Thank you. Pedro, ¿quieres hacer algún comentario? Si te puedes presentar y comentar algo.
Está bien. Está bien. O sea,
Ok.
yo soy,
Ok,
para
perfecto.
presentarme sí puedo. O sea, soy el
Sí.
estudiante de doctorado de Félix y estoy estudiando cómo se ha implementado su sistema en el INEGI
Ujú.
y las prácticas del INSP.
Perfecto. Sí, Pedro estuvo en una estancia de investigación en su doctorado acá con nosotros en el instituto, en la unidad de inteligencia en salud pública. Pedro, te mandé una pregunta por WhatsApp, ¿se la puedes leer al doctor
Sí.
Félix?
Sí, sí. So, Elena Sophia asked, what security methods are used to protect governmental data in the UK? Are you aware of the specific encryption techniques employed, such as RSA or others?
No is the answer. So IT is my weak spot. So I don't know. So I work a lot with the secure facilities, although I am working with the data archive about downloadable files, scientific use files people can take away and work on. I don't know how organizations generally do this. And I'm not sure who would be the best person to ask about this. The trouble is, health organizations in the UK have been a bit problematic. Health health research is very good on ethics. It's been very poor on basically all sorts of other aspects of this. So social science, where we develop 5 safes and all these things, that has been pretty good on data governance from the start because we had to justify everything. Health, we've been doing it for a long time before we started to worry about things. So the main thing we worried about was the ethics. Other things like actually making sure the data was appropriately stored and it was the right sort of data and things, that was quite poorly looked after. Essentially, medical research was run on what we might call a good chaps model, a good boys model, that obviously this person is a good person, they can have the data and they will obviously look after it. That is still quite common in medical research. It's now changing. There aren't very many examples of that now, but there are still some out there where essentially you just trust people to look after the data. So I think most of the interest at the moment is going to the secure labs, for which the only level of encryption is at the accessing the lab. I don't know what you'd have to do about data being stored. I'm trying to think of an organization that would help, but probably something like Cancer Research or something would possibly be the most useful organization to talk to, because a bit like you, they support other research, but they also do a lot of research themselves, and they also have a secure facility, and they also have data sets for downloading. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I would suggest putting you in touch with a couple of organizations that might help.
Linus, we also wanted to ask if you have any comments regarding the risks and consequences of breaches of data, specifically in like the health area, and for example, like genetic biobanks. When there's a breach, like what can happen?
Yeah. I mean, what can happen is, for example, public I will talk from the UK experience now. So the public in the UK generally is very supportive of research. Generally, they're very supportive of the health service. They're generally very happy for academic researchers to be doing things. But when breaches get known, they do get widely publicized. So there was a project called care.data about 5-6 years ago, where the aim was to collect information from doctors and make it available for researchers. Partly because it wasn't well thought out, but partly because it was very badly explained. This caused an awful lot of concern about what was being done with our health data. And as a result, the next 5 years, no one tried to get this data out of doctors again. So it wasn't until the pandemic came along, we started to think about how to be used, but that basically closed down a whole area of health research for 4 or 5 years until the pandemic. So it can be really, really significant. Quite often the public notes these things and then forgets about them. But the important point is that the people who make decisions would know about these things. So when I said about the doctors issue, that the general public might have forgotten about this care.data problem, but the doctors hadn't, and the doctors were very keen to say, nope, you cannot have my data. So the data is not there. So it can be really important, because it doesn't matter that there are different parts of the health sector or different parts of government. If the tax department does something wrong, people will say, oh, it's the government can't manage your data. So the whole of the government is seen as being this. So that's why I'm really keen on this idea that we work together. If things go wrong, because they do go wrong, we work together to sort them out and make sure they happen on there. And I have no time for people who deliberately want to do things for their own benefit. I'm very friendly to researchers who make mistakes or who want to do the right thing, try these things, but I have no time at all for people who just want to do their own thing and have no idea of the consequences.
Perfecto, muchas gracias. Creo que estamos justos en tiempo. Nos tomamos unos minutos de más por el inconveniente que tuvimos. Pues les agradecemos a todos su asistencia. Thank you, Dr. Felix. Muchas gracias a todos por sus comentarios y bueno, les agradecemos su presencia en el seminario mensual del Centro de Investigación y Evaluación de Encuestas y los invitamos al próximo mes, en julio, el siguiente seminario. Gracias a todos.